Hello and welcome to this session. Thank you for joining. The session today is entitled It's Not You, It's Me, How to Overcome Insider Threats and Protect Your Sensitive Data. My name is Tim DeLuca-Smith. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here at Casosis. Our solution endpoint protector might already be familiar to you as being the leading data loss prevention solution for Mac OS. And while we are a cross-platform solution also covering Windows and Linux, we are very much a Mac-first organization. So I'm delighted to welcome my panelists for today, Roman Focal, the founder and CEO of Casosis, our CTO, Jonathan Orford, and our Director of Enterprise, Zoran Kokoira. So with that introduction, I actually want to kick off this session with one very simple question, just to get us into the swing of things. And that's a bit of a look, a state of the nation, if you will. Has the landscape for security and data protection fundamentally changed over the last 18 months? Has that risk to organizations increased? And if so, how? I think what I'd like to do is just open it up to the panel and ask you to give me your view on the state of the data security market as it stands. Roman, I wonder if I can start with you and get your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think thinking back the last 1.5 years or so, I think everybody in the IT security wider domain have seen a tremendous shift due to the pandemic, but even more due to the results of that, and that being namely working from home. So I think most companies 18 months ago could have never imagined to have so many of their employees working from home, and that in turn led to so much sensitive data leaving what was previously all on-prem to what is now on individuals' endpoints at home, and in our context on many Macs at home. And even if it's not permanently there, it's accessible from there. So I think everything has really shifted over the last 1.5 years just to support that, just to keep companies being able to work, be productive.
Got it. Thank you. And I wanted to say Jonathan because that's how I introduced you, but to your friends, you're Jono. So I'm just going to call you Jono. Jono, how about yourself? Maybe some thoughts.
Thanks, Tim. Just looking at it from a Mac perspective, and it's as Roman has mentioned, we have a lot of people working from home now, but also the Mac market has grown significantly. From 5.8% in Q1 in 2020 now to 8% in Q1 2021. So you need to be really concerned about your Mac endpoints as well. And companies are really keen to attract and retain talent. More employees are available in the market globally, and we need them to stay productive. So we are offering them the operating system that they prefer. So it's no longer acceptable to just give them a Windows machine. And as Roman also mentioned, working remotely doesn't mean just working from home. A lot of these workers are working between the office now and home. They're going to coffee shops. They're using laptops. They want those laptops to remain performant and have good battery life. So these are the things we need to account for as well now. And as an administrator, you want the tooling that's going to allow you to secure this setup and make sure Mac OS is accounted for, whether that employee is in the office, in a coffee shop, or at home.
And Zoran, as a director of enterprise, you're obviously talking to large organizations on a daily basis, I imagine. So have you seen any sort of shifts in how they're thinking about data protection, data security over the last 18 months?
Yeah, there is no doubt, Tim, that massive changes happened in the last 1.5 years in the way people work. Work from home, I guess, became the new norm, even for organizations who never had any sort of work from home policies before. And employees just got used to Zoom meetings. Companies realized that productivity is not affected. So what initially looked like a necessary compromise, I think became a win-win situation for everyone. But do you know what comes after work from home? It's work from anywhere. And this makes things even more challenging for data security and data protection teams, because data is now more portable than ever. And on top of that, I think that the data that we produce and the number of applications that we use on a daily basis grew significantly in the last 1.5 years. This is, I think, the state of the nation. This is what IT security is dealing with heading into 2022.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks for that little glimpse into your thoughts, guys. Now, the title of this presentation talks to insider threats, and I just want to touch on why we've chosen that as the subject of today's conversation. You know, I think I always joke, right? I think if we were to rely exclusively on the media as our source of information, we'd be led to believe that the number one threat to our data is a hacker sitting in a dark room constantly trying to infiltrate our networks. And the reality is very different, right? You know, in more than 50% of cases, breaches are caused by employees. That's not to say that these are malicious attempts to exfiltrate sensitive data, although of course that does happen. The majority is simply down to, you know, let's just call it employee negligence and how they're using the tools and apps available to them, whether it be storing PII on USBs or sharing it over Slack or other channels. So we wanted to cover this topic and that sort of sensitivity of data, not only because it's important, but I think it fundamentally impacts how we design and build the product for Mac. And Jono, I'm going to ask you a little bit about this in a minute. But before we get to that and how we think about the product, let me just ask you, Zoran, about when I use the term risk, right? What actually does that mean to organizations when they think of risk?
It feels like this slide is the most used one in any DLP vendor's presentation deck. But we have to talk about it for sure. When you talk about DLP, you have to talk about risks. And in the last 12 years in my role, I had the chance to talk to hundreds of organizations. And my expertise is DLP. And what I've learned all these years is that there are typically two main reasons why an organization decides to invest into a data loss prevention solution. Number one would be to become compliant with client requirements and various industry-specific regulations. Everyone heard about PCI, HIPAA, or GDPR, so I don't think we need to expand on this. A DLP solution can help with this type of regulations, but I would like to point out for those who are not very familiar with data loss prevention solutions that the DLP solution alone will not make you PCI or HIPAA or GDPR compliant. There are other tools that you have to use, but it will definitely help you to address certain aspects of these regulations. So this is one main driver for DLP. The other main reason why an organization would invest into a data loss prevention solution is to enhance its security. Protecting intellectual property, source code, PIIs, healthcare data, client data, HR data is what DLP is designed for. Now, these two reasons are obviously not mutually exclusive. As a matter of fact, they usually go hand in hand. And when an organization fails to meet regulatory requirements, or when a data leakage happens due to maybe a lack of security tools or misconfigured policies, there are always consequences. Getting a fine is probably the most obvious consequence, but we should not forget about the people who in some cases will lose their job as a result maybe of a major data leakage incident. There is also the damage to the brand that often is not taken into consideration, most probably because it's difficult to put a dollar amount on it. Now just imagine spending millions of dollars all these years on PR and marketing to build a brand and establish your reputation. Then Bob comes who makes a mistake and your company is all over the news. And that proverbial saying that any publicity is good publicity, I don't think it applies here. The good news is that there are tools and there are ways to mitigate and to minimize these risks.
And I often think, you know, when we sort of think about DLP in the sort of context of protecting data, it's, you know, we typically jump to things like protecting PII, right, and meeting, data privacy requirements. And it's not only, GDPRs and these. There's a lot of industry owned regulation now, whether it be HIPAA or other. But I think the one that's often overlooked, correct me if I'm wrong, is this confidential IP. There's a lot of organizational IP that exists in businesses, process documents, how we onboard team members, financial results, all of this type of information that exists that sets a business apart, right? And I think often it's that confidential IP that's, because it's hard to quantify. How do you put an ROI, right, on protecting that? I can put an ROI on getting a fine. I can sort of get an ROI on my brand damage, but how do I put a price on protecting confidential IP? I think that's always one that's often overlooked. I don't know if you think that's fair or not.
Yeah, I totally agree on that, Tim. Just maybe one more thought here. And that ROI has to be proven to the C-level executives, because they are the ones who decide if they want to spend on a DLP solution or not. And if you can put some numbers in front of C-level executives, oftentimes they just don't approve a certain project. And yeah, this is challenging to demonstrate this for that IP that you just mentioned, with the business processes and other intellectual property that belongs to an organization.
So let's shift it up a gear and talk technology and how we actually address this, because I think, and Roman, I'm going to ask this of you, because I think, in terms of managing risk effectively for an organization, the landscape for security solutions has absolutely exploded over the last couple of years. So there are various technologies, various mechanisms by which organizations can choose to protect their data. I wonder if you could, really just explain that inherent difference between approaching the challenge from an endpoint perspective or through a networked based approach, and what the benefits or cons may be. And I imagine it's a blend of both that is required.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with this way of working from home, more and more IP IP being accessible or sitting on endpoints, you need a blend of a few solutions, right? And not only a few solutions, but actually a blend of your approach to that. So the endpoint, the network, and let's add also cloud here, is what makes it a challenge, I think, for the IT team in order to, deal with data governance and all of those kind of things. But I think they all have valid reasons for being in existence, and they're all necessary. So when we deal with data at rest on an endpoint, it is something that is a necessity, because that endpoint sometimes is online, sometimes that endpoint is offline. In our case, usually these are MacBooks with employees working from anywhere, like Zoran said. Nowadays, it's a big challenge. So you need to have your protection in place. Whether it's online, whether it's offline, the device, you cannot rely on a networked only solution, or you cannot rely on a cloud only solution. So you need a solution that covers all of these aspects, or various best of breed solutions that could, limit your risk vector in any of those ways. So the main thing is for us is we want to enable our customers to allow the end user to feel a minimum impact or no impact at all, while making sure that if the device is online, offline, we make sure we are, protecting the employee and protecting the intellectual property or PII that we are dealing with. So, and these decisions, they have to happen on, a device, and they have to happen fast before, they end up in just a log file that is in a CM solution, and then you might have already had that data leak that you tried to prevent in the first place. So endpoint, network, and cloud, all of them need to be addressed when it comes to a holistic data loss prevention strategy for a business.
Okay, got it. And I think I think as you said, devices working outside of the network, devices working offline, has really, the occurrence of that has probably increased with sort of introduction of hybrid work and the changes that we've seen over the last 18 months. But I think the other thing that I've noticed has changed a lot is really our sort of understanding. Well, what actually are we trying to protect? What are we trying to protect it from? And when? And part of that discussion is, long gone is this idea of protecting structured data repository, right? So it's not just files. I think that's the key sort of subject I talk to a lot of people about. It's not just files that we're protecting now. It's the data within it, because we now have access to messaging apps like Slack or Microsoft Teams or through email, and it's not just attachment of files, it's cutting and pasting confidential information out and putting it into this. It's such a seamless, frictionless experience now just to share a piece of information and data across a wide distributed group of people without necessarily thinking about that data and what it is, and have I thought about my security policies, and do I remember my security training? I guess, Zoran, maybe just touching on this from your perspective again, when you're talking to organizations, do you think they actually have a really good sense of what they're trying to protect?
It depends. So if an organization had a DLP solution before, they know exactly what they want to protect. But we also talked to many organizations that never had a data loss prevention solution in place before, and they have no idea what they want to protect. So this is where DLP comes in. When you get a big picture, you get the baseline of what is happening in the network, what is happening on the computers, about the data that is being sent out, and then after you have that visibility into the data movement, then you can come in as a DLP solution and really do your job and protect that data.
Perfect. Right. So that's a perfect time. Let's spin this up, and let's talk to you, Jono, because I think, thinking about, we've spoken about network versus endpoint and cloud. We've looked at the different types of data and how it's being used. Maybe it's a good time to ask you how you think about the Mac landscape and what that means for building a DLP solution for Mac OS. And I included this quote here, actually, before I hand over. Sorry, I included this quote here in the slide because, I think certainly there's a uniqueness amongst Mac OS users for immediate support, right? I won't name the name; it's a household name, but I think they'd said more than half of their employees had upgraded to Big Sur within 24 hours of release. Right, there was no room, right, to have a break in their security policies, which is just one example. But I'll hand over to you and let us know your thoughts.
Sure, thanks, Tim. I want to go back to 2005, and I think for those of us that have used Macs for many years, we were really excited to hear that Apple was moving away from PowerPC and were adopting Intel, and that allowed a lot of vendors to start producing software for this platform. And we were very glad, because we were often second-class citizens and we didn't have the same level of software support. But even after that, MacBooks and other Apple hardware were still considered expensive compared to Windows laptops that kind of just got the job done. And it was often only executives that had access to that platform. However, as I mentioned earlier, as we've been starting to attract and retain talent, we have been offering new employees the option of which operating system they would like to use. But we did it reluctantly, and we often did it on a case-by-case basis. And I think what's happened November last year is something very exciting for Mac OS, and that was the introduction of Apple's own silicon, the M1 chip. And this now has really a revolutionary price to performance ratio with exceptional battery life. And I can see that this is really going to drive the adoption of Mac OS because it can be considered the cheapest option with low cost of ownership and all the benefits that Macs and Mac OS offer. So this is great for administrators, but now we need to make sure we have the right software running on these Macs, and that software must make good use of that M1 chip, the new frameworks that Apple are introducing on a regular basis. But saying that, I did some research, and just to highlight that performance, it's said that Excel now is double the speed on these new chips, and Zoom requires half the battery life. That's just how important this new chip is, I think, to the industry. Sadly, if you just do some more research and you look at the four of some of the password managers out there, and I researched 4 of them, only one was compiled natively for this new chip, and therefore not making good use of that price performance ratio. So really important that we have software that is compiled for these new chips. Likewise, Apple are moving forward at a rapid pace. They're releasing new versions of macOS on an annual basis, often with new frameworks and sometimes deprecating some older frameworks. Again, you want to use software that has 0-day support, and that software is going to continue to perform even on day one, if not during the beta of those new versions of macOS. So at Casosis, we are very proud of the fact that our agents are compiled for that new technology and therefore perform well and utilize as little battery power as possible. We've been optimizing our code base for 10 years so that we know it runs efficiently even on a laptop, even if the employees are working remotely. We have guaranteed day 0 support, and we're utilizing Apple's latest frameworks. A good example is the Net Extension Framework, which was released in 10.10. And then later Apple released a new class within that framework called the Any Transparent Proxy Provider. And that allows us to offer new features like DPI in Big Sur, and that helps us with content-aware protection. And as Tim and Zoran mentioned earlier, you need to be monitoring how that data is used within applications and from one application to another. It's not just good enough to look at file storage any longer. And this allows us to provide administrators with a good DLP solution that continues to work throughout the Mac lifecycle. Thanks, Tim.
Perfect. Thanks for that insight, Jono. I think it's fair to say, anybody that's worked in the software industry for any amount of time really will know this to be true, right? And that it's not, you can't solve these problems with software alone, right? There are other process changes. There are human beings, employees behind all this. And I wonder if we could just close this session. We only have a couple of minutes left, so we'll keep this brief. But let's share some best practices. So often we see security admins, IT admins having a much harder life than is really necessary because of poorly deployed programs, right? So I'm going to start with you, Zoran. Let's try and keep it to sort of 30 seconds, but maybe just share some best practices, some takeaways that people can leave this session with.
I like to hang out on the Mac admin's Slack workspace, and I have to admit that the general feeling about DLP is not really positive over there. So I have a couple of suggestions that hopefully will make the life of IT administrators and security personnel better in terms of DLP when it comes to a DLP strategy. And I think that it all starts with the agent deployment. The first challenge that IT administrators have with Mac DLP is to get the agent installed. And you might think that this is really simple. It's not common to have issues deploying a Mac agent, but you have to pre-approve the system extension, give it full disk access, set up extension attributes, and so on. So having good documentation about how to install a Mac agent, I think is key here. And I like it when IT administrators ask us if we have an MDM deployment guide, because we don't just have an MDM deployment guide, but we have a Jamf deployment guide that we can provide them. It shows you how to build a PPPC profile and all that fun stuff. The second suggestion that I would have for an effective DLP program is to take time to understand how users work, what tools they use to complete their daily tasks, what are their workflows and processes. And we briefly talked about this, so I won't expand on it, as you said it to keep it to 30 seconds. But maybe the final and the third suggestion is to not forget about the educational aspect of a DLP solution. The alerts and notifications users get when a potential policy violation happens should have a powerful educational component. So users can understand why their actions were flagged and to avoid that kind of situations in the future.
Perfect. Thank you, Zoran. Jono, how about yourself? Give us a couple of key takeaways that people can think about.
Yeah, thanks, Tim and Zoran. I think I just want to build on what Zoran mentioned earlier and just highlight that it's not just good software development practices that are going to produce, software that you want to run on your battery efficient Mac. It's also how you go about testing them. So, we know that Jamf is so important to us and to our administrators. So we make sure we regression test that for every major version of Mac OS and every major version of our software. And we also go beyond that and test our software with other enterprise applications like Slack and Teams and Outlook to make sure that there's as few problems as possible.
And I think one of the others things to mention, Jono, because I know it sits in your world as a CTO, you've spoken a lot about the sort of technology and how you build, but it's the support effort, right, as well, and how we support this and how we bring, real, technical level engineers into our support world to support the guys out there. Roman, let me end with you. Of all of us, you've been in this space longer than anyone, so give us a couple of final takeaways, and I mean that in the nicest possible way.
Thanks, Tim. So I think maybe one very important point that Zoran just made before: involve your users and understand their needs, whatever tooling you are putting in place, and build policies that support your users and that understand them and don't work against them. Because to involve them, it's a great thing if they take away these educational things as well that Zoran mentioned. But as a conclusion, I would say I really missed to attend that event in Minneapolis in person. Come and stop by our virtual booth. You can meet some of us there, I think. I think we are doing this since such a long time. We started, supporting macOS, in the time of Snow Leopard decade ago. This support, the same day support is something essential for us. We take same day support for new macOS versions incredibly serious, even though we have to throw a lot of resources in, backing up what we're saying in this aspect. But like Jono mentioned, we love the products that are out there, and we want to fully support them so that people working from anywhere can really take advantage of them. So no other conclusions.
Great. Thank you, Roman. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you to my panelists for sharing their thoughts with us today. As Roman said, please come and check us out at our virtual booth. You can also find us on the Jamf marketplace, and of course you can find us at endpointprotector.com. We've got a library of great blog content and white papers that talk specifically about Mac OS and Enterprise and how to manage DLP across your fleet. So enjoy the rest of the sessions, guys. I hope that's been interesting for you. And once again, thank you for listening.